Can you imagine hearing the cruelest words from your own daughter and knowing that a lifetime of love and sacrifice was a lie? I was there, sitting in my own house, feeling like a burden, while my daughter, the only person I had left, waited for life to abandon me so she could have everything. What I'm about to tell you isn't a simple story. It's a brutal lesson that no one tells you about, and it hit me when I thought I had nothing left to lose. Imagine waking up one day, 85 years old, in the same Andalusian estate your great-grandfather built, and feeling like a ghost there. Your world becomes a gilded prison, where the people who should love you treat you with the cold kindness of self-interest. That was my life, a routine of loneliness and nostalgia, until a simple whisper, a phrase I overheard by accident, changed everything. Today, I'm going to show you how the greatest betrayal can become the strength to regain your dignity. Every second of this story counts, because if you ignore this lesson, you risk seeing your heart broken by those you love most. Stay with me until the end, because I'm going to reveal the only secret that saved me and how my will became the perfect weapon to teach them a lesson. You won't believe what happened when my daughter read those last words. My name is Ricardo Aguilar. I'm 85 years old, and I've lived my entire life on a farm in sunny Andalusia. I was born here, grew up here, and buried my wife Mercedes here 15 years ago. Since then, time seems to have become heavier, slower. The days begin early, with the song of the birds that still dare to visit my fields, and end with absolute silence seeping through the windows. My hands, hardened by decades of working the land, no longer have the strength they once had, but they still remember every corner of this place. My daughter Isabel moved to the farm 3 years ago with her husband Felipe and their 2 children, supposedly to take better care of me. At first, I thought it was a gesture of love, a chance to escape being alone and watch my grandchildren grow up. But the reality was different. The house, which always smelled of freshly baked bread and burning wood, now smells of cheap disinfectant and reheated food. The laughter I hear is always between them, never with me. My days have become a silent routine. I have breakfast alone at the large table. I walk slowly around the patio, remembering when those flower pots were full of red geraniums. And then I lock myself in the office, where the walls still hold the scent of books and the echo of conversations with Mercedes. Isabel passes by me as if I were just another piece of furniture. And Felipe, well, he never looked me in the eye for long. I don't consider myself a perfect man, but I was always a father who gave his all. I worked the land until my bones creaked. I paid for the best education for Isabel, and when she married, I gave her a plot of land to build her own house. However, life gave me back this strange present, feeling like an unwanted guest on the very property I built with my own hands. Sometimes I wonder if everything I did was in vain. My birthday dawned clear, with that deep blue sky that only Andalusia can display in autumn. When I went downstairs, I saw poorly inflated balloons and a supermarket cake on the table. It wasn't much, but I took it as a gesture, an acknowledgement that at least that day they would consider me. Carmen, my oldest granddaughter, was the only one who hugged me tightly and said, "Happy birthday, Grandpa," looking me in the eyes. That gesture, though small, sustained me for a few hours. During the afternoon, while everyone was talking in the kitchen, I sat in my armchair by the window, listening to the voices filter through the hallway. It was then that I heard Isabel, in that dry tone she uses when she thinks no one is listening, say on the phone, "Dad's lived enough. Now it's our turn." I froze. I didn't even blink. I felt a strange heat rise in my chest, as if my blood wanted to boil. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring into space. The phrase echoed in my head like an unbearable echo. "You've lived enough." What kind of daughter says that to her father? I suddenly realized it wasn't a slip or a cruel joke. It was a plan. She and Felipe were waiting for me to leave so they could take everything. the farm, my memories, even the old tools I keep in the shed. In that instant, something inside me broke. But it wasn't just pain, it was also clarity. I realized I had been blind for too long, that I had confused closeness with interest. I took a deep breath and, without making a sound, got up from the armchair. I knew exactly where the document that would change everything was. The will I wrote 2 years ago, leaving the estate not to Isabel, but to Carmen, the only one in this house who still seems to understand what it means to love this land. The will was tucked away in the bottom drawer of my desk, in a cream-colored envelope with my signature in blue ink. No one in this house knew of its existence, except my lawyer and me. We wrote it on a hot July afternoon, after Carmen accompanied me to prune the olive trees and told me she wanted to learn everything about the estate. At that moment, I knew she was the only worthy heir. I didn't do it to punish Isabel, but to ensure that the land would go to someone who loved it. That night at dinner, I barely spoke. I watched Isabel and Felipe's every gesture. He avoided looking at me, absorbed in his phone, while she droned on about plans to modernize the estate, tear down the barn, and build a pool. Every word confirmed what I'd heard that afternoon. Carmen, sitting to my left, silently passed me the bread, as if sensing something wasn't right. When I finished, I retreated to the office, using the excuse that I was tired. I turned on the table lamp, the one Mercedes adored, and placed the will on the polished wooden surface. I stared at it for several minutes, mentally reviewing the clauses, recalling the conversations with my lawyer, and the certainty that I was doing the right thing. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the lemon tree, gently tapping against the window. I couldn't sleep well. Isabel's words kept waking me up, as if they were drilling into my head. At one point, I got up and went to the kitchen to get a drink of water. There, I saw a light on in the living room. I approached quietly and found Felipe sorting through some papers. When he saw me, he jumped. "Oh, Don Ricardo, I was looking for the electricity contract," he said, quickly putting away what he was holding. I didn't believe a word he said. The next morning, I sat on the porch drinking coffee as the sun bathed the olive groves. Carmen came out and sat next to me. "Grandpa, are you okay? You looked serious yesterday," she asked. I looked at her and, for the first time in days, smiled. "I'm fine, kid. It's just that sometimes you have to remind some people that life isn't an expected inheritance, but something you cultivate day by day." She looked at me curiously but didn't ask any more questions. I decided the time to act would be that very afternoon. I didn't want any shouting or dramatic scenes, but I did want to make things clear. I prepared a folder with the will, my ID, and a brief letter to Isabel. The letter contained no reproaches, just the truth, that the property would belong to Carmen, because she had earned it with love and respect. I signed my name in my slow but firm handwriting, as if each stroke were a root sinking deeper into the earth. The birthday party would continue that afternoon with some neighbors Isabel had invited. I would take advantage of the gathering to make the message clear. I dressed in my brown cloth jacket, the same one I wore to cattle shows, and went down to the living room. Isabel was standing there, giving orders to make sure everything was perfect. When the guests arrived, she didn't even ask me how I was. When the first neighbors arrived, I sat in my usual armchair, my folder on my lap. I waited for everyone to settle in and the bustle to fill the living room. Then I raised my voice just enough for silence. "Before we blow out the candles, I want to share something with my family and friends," I said, looking directly at Isabel. She smiled, that forced smile that escapes her when she doesn't know what's coming. Everyone fell silent. Even the children stopped laughing. I felt the weight of their gaze on me, but it didn't bother me. At my age, one learns that what truly bothers us isn't attention, but indifference. I held the folder with both hands and opened it slowly, like someone opening a chest that has long held something valuable. Today is not just my birthday, I began in a firm voice. I also want you to know that I've made a decision about what will happen to this property when I'm gone. I saw Isabel's eyes light up with a mixture of nerves and anticipation, while Felipe leaned forward slightly, as if he wanted to hear every word. Carmen, on the other hand, looked at me with surprise but without anxiety. 2 years ago, I wrote my will, I continued, letting the growing murmur in the room die down. I didn't do it lightly, nor on a whim. I thought about it for weeks, remembering every effort, every sunrise, and every harvest this land produced. I ran my hand over the paper as if caressing the skin of the estate itself. I have decided that everything you see here, the house, the fields, the livestock, the tools, will belong to someone who has proven to love and respect this place more than their own rest. A restless murmur ran through the room, and before anyone could interrupt me, I added, "My heir will be my granddaughter, Carmen." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the ticking of the living room clock. Carmen's eyes widened, her hand going to her mouth. Isabel, on the other hand, paled suddenly, as if someone had knocked the wind out of her lungs. Felipe, rigid, clenched his jaw while his fingers drummed against the table. I watched them all, aware that this moment would be etched in each of their memories. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was a strange peace, the peace of someone who has finally put things right. Isabel tried to react, but her voice cracked. "But, Dad, why? How can you—" She stopped, perhaps because she knew any words at that moment would be useless. I raised a hand, asking for silence. "Because I listened, Isabel. I listened when you said I'd lived enough and that now it was your turn. Because this farm isn't a trophy or a bank account. It's a home, and homes are cared for, not waited for like vultures." My words were harsh, yes, but they were the truth. I felt like it was the first time in years I'd spoken to myself without holding my tongue. Carmen, still stunned, looked at me and whispered, "Grandpa, I don't know what to say." I responded with a small, sincere smile. "You don't have to say anything now, child. Just keep loving this place the way you do. That will be the best answer you can give me." The neighbors present shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the tension, but also intrigued. Some nodded slightly, as if they fully understood what I was doing. I wasn't looking for applause, but I didn't care if the town knew the truth either. Felipe, in a tone that attempted to sound calm but dripped with anger, said, "Don Ricardo, this isn't fair. Isabel is your daughter." I interrupted him before he could continue. "That's precisely why I expected something different from her. Being a daughter isn't just a title, it's a responsibility, and that responsibility is demonstrated in the small moments, not just when inheritances are involved." I saw him press his lips together and shift his gaze to the floor. The room was still silent, but that silence was no longer one of surprise. It was the awkward silence that arises when a truth is exposed that everyone would prefer to avoid. I sat up slowly, leaning on the cane I always keep by the chair. My hands weren't shaking, and that surprised me. "I don't know how much time I have left," I said, "but I know I won't spend it feeling like a guest in my own house. Isabel, Felipe, you will continue to live here as long as I live because I am not a cruel man. But understand that what was built with love can only be inherited by those who know how to care for it with that same love. I didn't seek his approval. I didn't need his blessing. This was my moment to make it clear that dignity is also inherited." I ended the meeting by closing the folder and placing it on the living room table. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to blow out the candles. I'm 85 years old, and I don't intend to waste another minute arguing about what's already been decided." I took a deep breath, looked at Carmen, and asked her to join me. She stood, still moved, and together we approached the cake. As I blew out the candles, I felt like I was not only celebrating a birthday, but also starting a new chapter, one in which I, finally, regained control over my own story. After the neighbors left, the house fell into a thick silence. Not even the television Felipe usually played at full volume could be heard. Carmen had retreated to her room, her eyes shining, I suppose, trying to process what had just happened. Isabel, on the other hand, stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, staring at the counter as if the veins in the stone might give her an answer. I poured myself a glass of water, unhurriedly, aware that the real conversation was yet to begin, although I had no intention of initiating it that evening. Felipe was the first to break the silence. This can be changed, right? A will can be changed, he said, trying to sound casual, but his tone was thick with anxiety. I didn't look up. Yes, Felipe, it can be changed, as long as I want to change it. And today, more than ever, I know I don't want to. I heard him exhale sharply, as if trying to hold back a response burning in his throat. Isabel remained silent, which I found more unsettling than any words. When she remains silent, it's not because she's accepting things, it's because she's planning her next move. That night, I slept better than I had in a long time. Perhaps because, for the first time in years, I wasn't burdened by doubt. When I woke up, the golden light of dawn filtered through the curtains, and I heard the familiar sound of Carmen's footsteps coming down the stairs. She found me on the porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Grandpa, thank you. Not for what you left me, but for trusting me." Her words were like a balm. I replied that trust is the only legacy worth more than land or money. At breakfast, Isabel appeared with a folder in her hand. She sat down across from me, slamming the folder down on the table. I was reviewing the accounts. "And if we continue like this farm won't be profitable in a few years. Do you really want Carmen to bear all this?" I didn't respond immediately. I just stared at her, letting her feel the weight of my silence. "Isabel," I finally said, "if you were truly concerned about profitability, you would have learned to take care of this land before thinking about selling it. Carmen will learn, and she will do it with love, not with empty numbers." Felipe intervened, perhaps believing he could smooth things. "Over? We could come to an agreement. You give us part of the estate now, we'll take care of modernizing it, and—" I interrupted him before he could finish. "No, Felipe. The estate isn't a commodity to be chopped up for profit. It's a home, a story, and as long as I breathe, it will remain that way." I saw his face tense, but he said no more. Breakfast ended without anyone bringing up the subject again, although the tension hung in the air like a heavy cloud that threatens to break at any moment. As the days passed, I began to notice small gestures that confirmed what I already knew. Isabel was resentful. She stopped telling me about family gatherings, didn't consult me about changes in the house, and sometimes responded with monosyllables when I tried to start a conversation. It wasn't anything I could point to as a direct attack, but rather a steady trickle of calculated indifference. Carmen, for her part, seemed to redouble her efforts to keep me company. She helped me check on the olive trees, asked me about the estate's stories, and even asked me to teach her how to repair the wooden fence. One afternoon, while we were looking through the wine cellar together, Carmen confessed to me that her mother had tried to convince her to give up the inheritance to avoid conflict. I looked at her in surprise, though not as surprised as I should have been. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. Carmen smiled with a gesture that reminded me of her grandmother. "I told her this. Estate is more than an inheritance. It's my childhood, it's my grandfather, it's the only thing I don't want to lose." I felt immense pride, mixed with sadness at knowing that the conversation wouldn't have been necessary if Isabel had understood the same thing. As autumn progressed, the days grew shorter and the nights colder. The living room fireplace was lit again, but not as before. Now Carmen and I sat there talking, while Isabel and Felipe shut themselves in their room. I don't know if it was a deliberate act of isolation, or simply a way to avoid looking me in the eye. What I did know was that the balance of this house had changed forever, and that, even if conversations were rare, the decisions had already been made. There was no going back. The confrontation that had been brewing since my birthday came one cold November night. I was in my office, reviewing some bank documents, when Isabel walked in without knocking. She slammed the door shut and stood in front of me, arms crossed and frowning. "Dad, we need to talk," she said in that deep voice she used when she was determined to impose something. I put my pen down on the table and looked at her silently, waiting for her to continue. "What you're doing isn't fair. Carmen's a child. She doesn't know anything about running a farm. I've been here all this time. I deserve at least a share." I felt the air thicken, as if each word she uttered weighed a kilo. I leaned back in my chair, calmly observing her. "Isabel, you've been here for 3 years, and you haven't learned anything about this land. You haven't planted a single olive tree. You haven't mended a fence. You haven't cared for the livestock. What do you think makes you worthy of this estate?" Her face reddened. I don't know if from anger or embarrassment. "I've taken care of you," she retorted, raising her voice. I smiled bitterly. "Take care of me? You barely speak to me. And when you do, it's to argue about money. That's not care, my child. That's presence management." His gaze hardened. "Dad, I don't want this to end badly, but if you insist on leaving everything to Carmen, don't expect us to still be here to help you." The words were clear, a threat disguised as a warning. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the desk. "Isabel, I'm not asking you to stay. If you want to leave, that will be your decision. But don't use my age or my health as bargaining chips. I've lived enough, as you said, and in that time I've learned to recognize who is there for love and who is there for self-interest." She remained silent, pressing her lips together, and finally left the office without another word. I heard the dry sound of the door closing, and for a moment I felt a strange emptiness. It wasn't pure sadness, but a mixture of disappointment and resignation. I knew that conversation had marked a before and after. From that night on, Isabel stopped trying to convince me with words. Her silence became colder and more calculated, as if she were waiting for the right moment to move again. The following days were tense. Felipe avoided my presence, and Carmen seemed to make more of an effort than ever to be present, perhaps to compensate for the distance from her mother. She accompanied me to the orchard. We checked the lemon trees, and she even helped me organize the old shed, where I still keep tools that belonged to my father. Those moments with her reminded me that, despite everything, I had made the right decision. The farm, in Carmen's hands, would have a future. In Isabel and Felipe's hands, it would become a real estate project in less than a year. One afternoon, as we walked through the olive grove, Carmen confided in me that her mother had told her not to get her hopes up, that I would change my mind. I told her not to worry, that the will was legally protected and no one could change it without my consent. "But, Grandpa, what if they try something strange?" she asked, with a mixture of fear and premature maturity. I assured her that in addition to my lawyer, I had left a copy in a safe deposit box at the bank. "They won't be able to do anything, Carmen, and if they try, they'll know I'm not a man who forgets." Winter arrived early that year. Frost painted the countryside white in the mornings, and the fireplace became the heart of the house. But even with the warmth of the fire, the family atmosphere remained icy. Isabel and Felipe barely shared any space with me, and when they did, it was out of obligation. Carmen, on the other hand, seemed more determined than ever to learn. She asked me to teach her how to recognize the exact ripeness of olives, and together we spent hours among the trees, talking about everything except inheritances. She knew that more than a will, I was giving her a piece of my life. One Sunday afternoon, while Carmen and I were sorting tools in the shed, we heard a car engine pull up in front of the house. Peeking out, I saw a man in a suit. Getting out, holding a folder, I recognized him immediately, a real estate agent from the neighboring town. Isabel and Felipe greeted him at the door and invited him in, not noticing me watching from afar. I felt the conflict I'd been trying to avoid was about to erupt in a much more direct and dangerous way. I stood motionless, watching from the shadow of the shed as the suited man shook hands with Felipe and Isabel. It was clear this wasn't a casual visit. I watched as Felipe gestured toward the fields, the barn, and the main house. While the agent jotted quick notes on a notebook, Carmen beside me frowned. "What's going on, Grandpa?" I didn't want to answer right away. I just asked her to be silent and for us to observe, because some truths are better revealed without interruption. After a few minutes, the three of them started walking toward the olive grove, probably to assess the land. It was then that I decided to come out of hiding and face the situation. I walked slowly, my cane marking each step on the dry earth. "I see we have visitors," I said loudly. The agent stopped, uncomfortable, and offered me a forced smile. "Good afternoon, Don Ricardo. I'm Javier, a real estate agent. Your daughter and son-in-law have asked me to come and appraise the property." The words were like a hammer blow, but I showed no surprise. I just nodded slowly. "Interesting," I replied, leaning a little more on my cane. "And tell me, Javier, did they also explain to you that this property is not for sale and that, moreover, it doesn't belong to them?" Silence fell like a brick. Felipe tried to intervene, but I stopped him with a wave of my hand. "No, Felipe. Now it's my turn to speak. Neither you nor Isabel have the right to offer what isn't yours. And if you ever bring anyone here again for this purpose, I will consider it an invasion of my home." My tone was so firm that even the agent took a step back. Isabel tried to smooth it over, as if it were all a misunderstanding. "Dad, don't be mad. We just wanted to know the real value of the land, out of curiosity." I stared at her, unblinking. "Curiosity doesn't bring real estate agents with folders and notebooks, Isabel. It brings conversations. It brings respect. It brings questions. What you did isn't curiosity, it's ambition." I felt a lump in my throat, not from fear, but from the certainty that there was no turning back. She looked away, unable to hold my gaze. The agent, seeing he wasn't welcome, excused himself and walked briskly away. The four of us stood in the middle of the olive grove, and silence returned. But this time it was filled with pure tension. Carmen took a step toward me, as if she wanted to stand between us. "Grandpa, let's go inside," she whispered. But I didn't move. "No, Carmen. This needs to be said right here." I turned to Isabel and Felipe. "I won't allow you to continue living on this property if all you're planning is to sell it when I'm gone. And if you try that again, I'll speak to my lawyer to have you leave the house immediately." Felipe, with a defiant tone I hadn't heard from him before, retorted, "You can't just kick us out." I smiled coldly. "Of course I can. As long as I'm alive, this is my house and my rules. And when I'm gone, it'll be Carmen's house, not yours. So think carefully before you take the next step." His words died in his throat, and I could see his jaw tense, as if he was holding back from blurting out something he'd later regret. We returned to the house without saying a word. Carmen and I stayed in the kitchen, making coffee, while Isabel and Felipe locked themselves in their room. She looked at me, visibly worried. "Grandpa, I think they're going to try something. I don't know what, but they won't stay still." I assured her that I was already prepared for any maneuver, and that I had even left clear instructions with my lawyer to act in case of any attempt at sale or manipulation. "Don't worry, Carmen. I didn't reach this age without learning to protect what's mine." That night, as I listened to the crackling of the fireplace, I thought of Mercedes. I wondered what she would say when she saw how her only daughter had allowed herself to be consumed by greed. Perhaps she would have asked me for patience. Perhaps she would have begged me to seek reconciliation. But I knew you can't build a bridge on rotten foundations. I closed my eyes, the fire illuminating my wrinkled hands, and resolved that, from that moment on, every step I took would be to protect the estate and ensure that Carmen inherited not only the land, but the dignity that came with it. The next morning, before Isabel and Felipe had even gotten up, I was already in the office calling my lawyer, Don Ernesto. We'd been working together for years, and he knew my character as much as I knew his. I told him what had happened with the real estate agent, and he was quick to react. "Don Ricardo, we're going to strengthen the will and add clauses that make any sale impossible without Carmen's consent. We can also stipulate a life usufruct for you in case they try to force your exit." His tone was confident and professional, and he instilled the calm I needed. We agreed to meet that same afternoon in his office. I didn't say anything to anyone. I left the house with the excuse of going to the doctor and drove to the village. In Don Ernesto's office, we went over every detail. I signed additional documents, opened a bank account in Carmen's name to transfer a small portion of my savings, and we also left notarial instructions so that, in the event of my death, all the keys and property deeds would be immediately handed over to my granddaughter. "With this, there's no loophole they can exploit," he assured me. I left feeling like I'd closed another door to Isabel and Felipe's intentions. When I returned to the estate, the atmosphere was strange. Felipe was standing on the porch, smoking a cigarette, something he rarely did in front of me. He watched me park and said nothing, but that long, sustained stare made it clear he suspected I'd made some move. I didn't give him the pleasure of asking. I went straight to the kitchen where Carmen was preparing a stew. "Where have you been, Grandpa?" she asked in a low voice, almost as if she knew the conversation shouldn't be overheard. "Protecting our future," I replied with a half smile. That afternoon, Isabel approached me in the living room. She no longer had the furious tone of days before. Now she sounded more calculated. "Dad, I've been thinking, maybe we were wrong. Maybe we should talk about how we can collaborate with Carmen on the farm when the time comes." Her sudden change of attitude made me smile inwardly, but on the outside I maintained a neutral expression. "Isabel, when the time comes, Carmen will decide with whom and how to collaborate. Until then, your only task is to live here, respecting the rules you already know." She nodded. Slowly, although I could see in her eyes that she wasn't happy, the following days were a kind of silent truce. There were no open arguments, but neither was there any reconciliation. Isabel and Felipe avoided mentioning the inheritance, although I noticed how, from time to time, they cast quick glances at Carmen, as if trying to gauge her position. Meanwhile, I intensified the lessons with my granddaughter. I taught her how to drive the tractor, identify pests on the olive trees, and negotiate. With the town's suppliers, it wasn't just about inheriting a property, but about being ready to defend it. One morning, while we were checking the irrigation system, Carmen told me something that surprised me. "Grandpa, I don't want you to suffer through all of this. If you want, when the time comes, we can sell the farm and live together in a quieter place." I looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and pride. "Carmen, what makes me suffer isn't the farm. It's the idea of someone who doesn't love it destroying it. If one day you decide to sell it because you feel that way, I will accept it. But don't give it away under pressure or for convenience. That land is more than a piece of land. It's our history." At the same time, I reinforced the property's physical security. I hired a locksmith to change the locks, installed cameras in strategic locations, and asked an old friend from town, Antonio, to stop by occasionally to check everything was in order when I wasn't home. It wasn't paranoia, it was foresight. I knew that when greed takes hold in a person, impulsive actions are quick to follow, and I preferred to be prepared. One night, as I poured myself a glass of wine, I heard muffled voices in Isabel's room. I couldn't understand everything, but I did hear one of Felipe's words that put me on alert. "If you don't do it the easy way, we'll find another way." I stood still, holding the glass, feeling the warmth of the wine contrast with the chill running down my back. It was confirmation that despite all my measures, they weren't going to give up so easily. That night, I could barely sleep. I lay listening to the creaking of the wood with each gust of wind, imagining it could be anything. Felipe's words kept echoing in my head. "We'll find another way." I didn't need to be a genius to understand what that implied. At 85, I was no longer worried about arguments. What worried me were the actions taken in the shadows, the ones that come when you least expect them. Before dawn, I had already decided that if they wanted to play dirty, I would be 3 steps ahead. Early in the morning, I called Don Ernesto again and asked him to prepare an additional document, a power of attorney granting Carmen immediate administration of the estate should I become incapacitated for any reason. It wasn't what I liked to think about, but I knew my fragile health could be used as an excuse to withdraw. With that power, even if I were admitted to a hospital, Carmen could continue to control every decision, preventing Isabel or Felipe from touching anything without her consent. That same afternoon, I invited Antonio, my friend from the village, to dinner at my house. He hadn't been here in a while, and his presence made Isabel and Felipe feel somewhat uneasy as they looked at each other with disapproving expressions. Between bites, I explained, in a voice loud enough for them to hear, that I was checking everything to make sure the estate was in good hands, even if something happened to me from one day to the next. I saw Felipe put his fork down and press his lips together. Isabel pretended to be focused on her food, but her cheeks flushed. From that day on, the tension became almost physical. I could feel it in the air, like when a storm approaches and the sky is charged with electricity. Isabel began to go out more often, and Felipe made quiet calls from the porch. Carmen noticed everything, but avoided asking me directly. I guess she didn't want to burden me with more worries, although it was too late for that. I also began to move more cautiously. I avoided leaving important documents at home and kept a copy of everything in the bank safety deposit box. One night, while I was reading in the living room, Carmen approached with a serious expression. "Grandpa, today I heard Mum tell Felipe that if you got sick, they could ask a judge to appoint them responsible for the estate." I calmly closed the book, but inside, I felt a chill. "That's not going to happen, Carmen. I've already spoken with Ernesto, and legally their hands are tied. But thank you for telling me, because it means they're not willing to stop." She nodded, but I could see she was still worried. It was the first time her youthful innocence had been overshadowed by the weight of mistrust. I decided the time had come for a direct conversation with Isabel and Felipe, not to convince them, because that was already impossible, but to make it clear that their maneuvering was going nowhere. I called them to the living room one afternoon. I sat in my armchair with Carmen at my side and waited for them to settle in. "I've noticed your movements, your calls, your visits, and I want you to understand that no matter how hard you try, this estate is no longer within your reach. It's not a threat, it's a fact." Felipe was the first to speak, his tone mocking. "So now we're enemies in our own house." I stared at him. "You're not enemies, but you're not allies either. You're my guests, and as long as you live here, you must behave as such. If you cross the line, I'll have no problem asking you to leave." Isabel clenched her fists and avoided looking at me, as if she knew any words at that moment would be fuel for a fire already burning. That night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, I sat alone in the living room, listening to the crackling of the fireplace. I thought about how much my life had changed in just a few months, from a silent routine to an invisible battlefield where every gesture and every word had a hidden meaning. And yet, I felt more alive than I had in years, because for the first time since Elizabeth and Philip arrived, I wasn't on the defensive. I was taking action, setting the rules, and I knew I would write the ending of this story. Isabel and Felipe's attempt was not long in coming. It was a cold December morning, one of those when frost covers the olive trees as if they were made of glass. I was on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, when I saw a black car park in front of the property. 2 formal-looking people got out, a man with a briefcase and a woman with a thick folder. It wasn't hard to guess what they were talking about. Felipe went out to greet them, and after a brief exchange, the 3 of them headed toward the entrance of the house. Carmen, who was next to me, looked at me with alarm. "Grandpa, what's happening now?" I already knew. They were bringing a notary or a solicitor to try some legal action. I sat there waiting for them to enter. When they did, Isabel adopted a falsely friendly tone. "Dad, these are some friends who will help us organize some important paperwork for when you're gone." That pause, laden with meaning, confirmed to me that this wasn't just an innocent affair. The man with the briefcase began taking out documents and placing them on the table, while the woman opened the folder and asked me for just a few signatures to expedite some paperwork. Didn't need to read much to realize they wanted me to sign a broad power of attorney that gave them control over the property. I stood up slowly, leaning on my cane, and approached the table. I took the papers and calmly reviewed them, page by page, while they waited with feigned patience. When I finished, I placed the stack of documents on the table and gently pushed them toward the man. "I'm not signing anything, and I advise you to gather your things and leave before I call the civil guard to report an attempt at coercion." Silence was immediate. Carmen stood up too, standing beside me, as if her mere presence reinforced my position. Felipe tried to remain calm, but his voice trembled. "Don Ricardo, it's not what you think." I interrupted him before he could finish. "It's exactly what I think, and if you underestimate me, believing my age makes me naive, you're wrong. I have documents, witnesses, and lawyers ready to act if you try again. Now get out of my house." I didn't have to repeat myself. The man and woman silently gathered their things and headed for the door. Isabel and Felipe followed, muttering under their breath, but not daring to look me in the eye. After the car left, Carmen hugged me tightly. "Grandpa, I was scared. I thought you were going to fall into the trap." I stroked her hair and smiled. "Daughter, at this age one has seen too many traps to fall into one so poorly designed. What worries me isn't that they'll try something, but that they won't stop as long as they live here. And because of that, I think the time has come to make a more drastic decision." She looked at me with a mixture of fear and curiosity, but didn't ask any more questions. That same afternoon, I called Don Ernesto and asked him to prepare the eviction notice for Isabel and Felipe. Legally, I could do so. They didn't have a lease or any real rights to the property, and their continued existence depended solely on my will. "Don Ricardo, this is going to make things extremely tense," he warned. "I know," I replied, "but there's no room for half measures. Either you respect this home or you abandon it." We agreed that I would have the paperwork ready the next day. During dinner, Isabel was strangely quiet. Felipe, on the other hand, tried to converse as if nothing had happened, but I barely responded. Carmen ate in silence, sensing that something important was about to happen. When I finished my plate, I put down my cutlery and looked at Isabel. "Tomorrow, you will receive a letter from my lawyer. Read it calmly, and if you want to prevent this from ending in the worst possible way, accept it without question." She frowned but said nothing. Silence once again filled the table. I didn't sleep much that night. I walked through the house, stopping in each room, remembering what it was like before the tension had set in. The estate had always been a place of life, work, and family. Now it was a chessboard where every move was calculated. I stopped in front of Carmen's bedroom door and listened to her calm breathing. That sound made me certain that I was doing the right thing. Because this wasn't just about protecting an inheritance, it was about protecting a legacy, and I wasn't going to fail in that. The next morning dawned gray, with a low sky that seemed to portend a storm. Mid-morning, I heard the engine of a car approaching. It was Don Ernesto's vehicle. I went down to the porch to greet him and accompanied him to the kitchen, where Carmen had already made coffee. "Here it is, Don Ricardo," she said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name and Isabel's on the outside. I held it for a few seconds, feeling the symbolic weight of that paper. It wasn't just a legal notification, it was the closing of a cycle. I went out to the living room, where Isabel and Felipe were watching television, and handed it to him without saying a word. Isabel opened it with tense hands. Her gaze scanned the lines of the document, and her eyebrows gradually furrowed into a hard line. "Are you kicking us out?" she asked, her tone a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I'm not kicking you out," I replied calmly. "I'm giving you back your freedom to live as you wish, far from this estate, because there's no longer any respect here. You have 30 days to leave. The deadline is more than generous, considering everything that's happened." Felipe stood up abruptly, as if trying to impose himself physically, but I stood my ground, leaning on my cane. "This is crazy, Don Ricardo," Felipe said, gesticulating. "You can't leave your own daughter on the street." I glared at him. "I'm not leaving my daughter on the street, Felipe. I'm giving her the chance to start over, away from a place she clearly doesn't value. And you're not my son, so spare me the sentimental speech." His lips thinned, and I saw a flash of suppressed fury in his eyes. Carmen entered the living room at that moment, stood beside me, and took my arm. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes. Isabel stood up slowly, the document still in her hand. "Dad, you can't do this to me," she said, but her voice was no longer angry, but something closer to pleading. For a moment, I saw in her the little girl who ran through the olive trees in her mud-stained dress, asking me to push her on the swing. That memory hurt me, but not enough to change my mind. "Isabel, what I can't do is continue living with someone who waits for me like someone waiting for an old tree to fall to grab the firewood. This isn't punishment, it's a consequence." The rest of the day passed in silence, broken only by the sound of Isabel and Felipe opening and closing doors and drawers. It wasn't quite a move yet, but the tension was palpable. Carmen and I took refuge in the shed, sorting through tools and organizing boxes. "Grandpa, do you think they'll leave without another fight?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "No, Carmen, but now any movement they make will be outside this house, and there the law will be on our side." 2 weeks passed without any major confrontations, although the atmosphere remained charged. Isabel avoided speaking to me, and Felipe went out more and more frequently. I didn't ask where he was going, because I wasn't interested. My focus was on strengthening my relationship with Carmen and continuing to teach her everything I could before the day came when she would be in charge of the farm alone. Every morning, we walked together among the olive trees, talking about pruning, watering, and the market. It was my way of ensuring that when the time came, I would be prepared. With a week left until the deadline, Felipe returned one night smelling of alcohol. He entered the living room where I was reading and began speaking in a raised voice. "You know what, Don Ricardo? You think you've won, but when you leave this world, you won't be around to see this estate become what we want it to be." I looked at him without getting up. "Felipe, that's exactly the kind of thinking that has put you where you are now, out of this house in a few days. And I assure you, even after my departure, you'll have so many legal obstacles that neither you nor anyone else will be able to touch this land." That night I locked my bedroom door, something I never did, not out of fear of physical harm, but to set a clear boundary. The estate was quiet under the moonlight, but inside the house, a silent war was raging that already had an end date. I went to bed thinking about Mercedes, imagining that in some way she would be proud that I defended not only the land we built together, but also the dignity we wanted to leave behind. The day of her departure dawned with a timid sun, filtering through the low clouds that still held traces of the night's humidity. From my window, I saw Felipe loading boxes into the trunk of his car, moving roughly. Isabel was in the kitchen, packing dishes and utensils that had mostly belonged to me before she moved. Out. I didn't say anything. I simply watched from a distance like a spectator watching the final scene of a play that had been running for too long. Carmen, silent, stayed close to me, perhaps fearing a last-minute confrontation. Mid-morning, Isabel entered the living room with an envelope in her hand. "It's for you," she said, placing it on the table without looking me in the eye. I didn't open it at that moment. I put it in my jacket pocket. "Take care, Dad," she added, though her voice lacked the warmth those words used to carry many years ago. Felipe behind her simply nodded, pressing his lips together. There were no hugs or prolonged goodbyes, just a slam of the front door that resonated throughout the house. That sound, dry and final, was the true closure. As the car disappeared down the dirt road, the estate seemed to breathe again. The silence was no longer heavy or tense. It was a living silence, like that of days when all you hear is the birds and the wind through the olive trees. Carmen sank into a chair on the porch and let out a long sigh. "I didn't think this day would come," she said. I sat down next to her and replied, "It always comes, Carmen. Sometimes it takes a while, but it comes. And when it does, the important thing is to be ready for it." That same afternoon, I opened the envelope Isabel had left me. Inside was a short letter, written in tight handwriting. It didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did it justify her actions. It simply said that she hoped someday she would come to understand her decisions. I read it twice, searching between the lines for anything that might hint at regret, but I didn't find it. I folded it carefully and put it in a desk drawer, not out of attachment, but as a reminder that even blood ties need boundaries. With the house to ourselves, Carmen and I set about reorganizing every corner. We opened windows, let fresh air flow through the hallways, and replaced photographs that had been stored away. The office regained its order, the kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread again, and the living room filled with the light that Isabel always insisted on blocking out with heavy curtains. It was as if the estate were awakening after a long slumber. The first few weeks without them were peaceful. Carmen resumed her distance learning, but every afternoon she went out to help me in the fields. Together we checked the fences, fixed a couple of sections of the irrigation system, and began planning for the upcoming olive season. I watched her work with her hands full of soil and felt that Mercedes, wherever she was, would be smiling. This wasn't just physical labor. It was an act of belonging and love. One Sunday, after a morning of work, we sat on the porch with a pitcher of lemonade. Carmen looked at me and said, "Grandpa, I want you to know that I never plan to sell this farm. Even if life takes me far away, I will always come back here." Her words touched me deeply. "That's all I needed to hear," I replied. Because in the end, more than an inheritance, what one wants to leave behind is the certainty that what one cared for with so much effort will remain in good hands. Little by little, the estate began to come alive again. Neighbors began to stop by more often, bringing bread, cheese, or simply a friendly conversation. Some said they could feel the change in the air, as if the house had recovered its essence. I felt it too. Every dawn, seeing the sun illuminate the olive trees, I knew I had made the right decision. And although part of me regretted that Isabel hadn't chosen another path, I understood that the peace we now had wouldn't have been possible any other way. The days began to take on a new, more serene and steady rhythm. I woke up to the smell of Carmen's coffee, and after breakfast, we would go out together to walk through the fields. She carried a notebook where she wrote down everything I taught her: when to prune, how to read the color of the leaves to detect pests, what to do if the irrigation water lost pressure. I saw a sparkle in her eyes that reminded me of my early years working alongside my father. There was no rush, no tension, just the time needed to care for the land as one cares for something sacred. One afternoon, while we were repairing the north fence, Carmen asked me, "Grandpa, do you think Mom will ever come to see you?" I was silent for a few seconds, weighing my answer. Maybe she will, but I don't know if it's to see me or to see what she can. Get out of here. That's why I don't want you to cling to that idea. What I do want is for you to cling to what we're building now. She nodded, hammering another nail into the wood without taking her eyes off her work. As the weeks passed, we began making small changes to the property. We restored the neglected vegetable garden, planted new rows of lavender near the driveway, and painted the shutters a deep green that stood out against the white walls. They were simple improvements, but each one brought life and character back to the place. Neighbors passing by always commented that the property was smiling again, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. One Sunday morning, we received a visit from Don Ernesto. He brought with him a final copy of all the documents securing the property in Carmen's name. We sat on the porch and reviewed each piece of paper. With this, Don Ricardo, no one will be able to touch this property without your permission or that of your granddaughter, he assured me, placing the documents in a thick folder. Carmen looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and responsibility. "This is much more than a piece of paper, Grandpa," she said. "I know," I replied. "It's your key to the future." That evening, while we were having dinner, Carmen told me she'd begun brainstorming ideas for diversifying production: artisanal olive oil, guided tours for tourists, and even cultivation workshops for village children. I listened attentively, amazed by her enthusiasm and vision. "If your grandmother were here, she'd be thrilled," I told her. "She always dreamed of opening the estate so others could learn to love it like we do." Carmen smiled and continued detailing her plans with a passion that energized me. Although my body no longer allowed me to work like I used to, I made sure to be with her in every way I could. We spent entire afternoons sorting through old tools, repairing what was still useful, and saying goodbye to what was beyond repair. "Everything here has a story," I would tell her, holding up a rusty hoe. "This one, for example, I used with your mother when I was little. We planted the orange trees in the south together." Carmen listened with interest, as if each anecdote were a treasure. Little by little, I began to feel that the farm was ready for a change. I no longer worried about what might happen if I wasn't there. Carmen had not only learned the technical tasks, but also understood the spirit of this place. She knew it wasn't just about producing, but about caring for, respecting, and keeping a history alive. That certainty gave me a peace I couldn't remember feeling in years. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and purple, we sat on a hill overlooking the entire estate. Carmen, her gaze fixed on the horizon, said, "Grandpa, when you're gone, this place will still be yours, because every corner will tell of who you were and what you taught me." I didn't respond immediately. I just placed my hand on hers. It was the simplest and most sincere way of telling her I trusted her completely. With the arrival of spring, the estate was filled with colors and aromas not felt so intensely for some time. The almond trees blossomed early, and the countryside was covered in a soft blanket of wildflowers. One morning, as we walked among the olive trees, I stopped in front of a very particular one I had planted with Mercedes the year Isabel was born. The trunk was bent by the wind, but it continued to bear abundant fruit. "Carmen, this tree is yours from today, not only because I give it to you, but because it symbolizes what I want you to remember. Life bends, but it doesn't break when its roots are deep." She hugged me tightly, as if she understood that this gesture was more important than any document. From that day on, Carmen began to mark some corners of the estate with small details that made it her own. A wooden bench by the well, a stone path leading to the vegetable garden, and even a swing hanging from a thick fig tree branch, just like she told me she had in her childhood. Each change brought with it a new energy, and I felt the estate respond to that renewed care. It was as if the place knew it was in the hands of someone who truly loved it. One afternoon, we received a visit from several village children with their teachers. Carmen had organized a small workshop to teach them how to plant and care for aromatic plants. I sat in a chair under the shade of a lemon tree, watching her speak enthusiastically, patiently explaining each step. The children listened attentively, and I couldn't help but think that this was exactly what Mercedes would have wanted, for the farm not to be a closed-off place, but a space for sharing and teaching. After the children left, Carmen came to sit with me. "Grandpa, do you realize what we're doing?" she asked. I replied that we were building something not measured in acres or money, but in stories and memories that would last forever. She smiled, and in that moment I knew I had inherited not just the land, but also the soul of this place. As the days passed, I began to feel a different, deeper tiredness. It wasn't pain or serious illness, but a sign that my body was asking for more rest. Carmen noticed and began taking on more tasks without my asking. One night, while we were having dinner, she said to me, "Grandpa, whenever you want, I can take on the daily work. Just tell me what needs to be done." I laughed softly. "Little girl, you've already done the most important thing. Learn. Now all you have to do is live it." I decided I wanted to leave one last gesture that would remain as a visible mark of my time here. I searched the old shed and found a wooden plaque my father had carved with our initials. I sanded it, varnished it, and together with Carmen, we placed it at the main entrance to the estate. In large letters, it read, "Finca Aguilar, since 1924. Seeing it hanging, I felt that this piece of history was secure beyond my lifetime. One weekend, we invited some nearby neighbors to celebrate the new milestone. It wasn't a loud party, but a simple meal under the large central olive tree. Amid laughter, anecdotes, and toasts, I could see how Carmen moved with ease, greeting, organizing, and making sure everyone felt welcome. I realized she no longer needed my constant guidance. She had become the heart of the estate. That night, as we closed the gates, I stood for a moment looking out at the moonlit field. Carmen approached and took my arm. "Thank you for trusting me, Grandpa." I responded without thinking. "It's not trust, Carmen. It's certainty. You are the root that will keep this land alive when I'm gone." She rested her head on my shoulder, and in that shared silence, I knew my mission was accomplished. The following days passed with a calm that almost seemed strange to me. After years of tension, intrigue, and veiled arguments, the silence of the estate was clear, filled with sounds that once seemed distant. The birdsong, the sound of the wind through the branches, the crackle of dry twigs under our feet. I woke up each morning certain that I was where I was supposed to be, and that I had made the right decisions, even if they were painful. Carmen, for her part, seemed to flourish in that tranquility, devoting herself to each task with a care that cannot be faked. One April morning, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching Carmen single-handedly direct 2 day laborers who had come to help with the pruning. She gave clear instructions, checked their work, and even joked with them. It was at that moment that I understood, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was no longer the one carrying the weight of the farm. She was. And far from feeling sad about giving up that role, I was filled with immense pride. Knowing that someone you love is ready to continue what you started is one of the few certainties life grants you. That afternoon, I decided to give her a very special key. It wasn't the house key or a padlock key, but a small, rusty iron key that opened an antique chest kept in the attic. When I placed it in her hand, she looked at me curiously. "What's inside?" I smiled. "Letters, photographs, documents, the entire history of this farm and our family. When I'm gone, that chest will be your guide to remember where you come from and why this land is what it is." Carmen closed her hand tightly around the key, as if she understood the symbolic weight it carried. We spent an entire afternoon in the attic, going through that chest. There were black and white photos of my parents, love letters Mercedes sent me when we were dating, old receipts for the first tools we bought, and even a hand-drawn map showing the original layout of the fields. Carmen listened to each story as if it were new, even though I'd told her some before. "I don't want any of this to be lost," she told me. And I knew it would be. A few days later, we received a letter from the city council inviting us to participate in a local producers' fair. Carmen was enthusiastic about the idea and decided we would bring olive oil in bottles labeled Finca Aguilar, Tradition and Roots. Seeing that label for the first time moved me more than I expected. It was as if the history of generations was condensed into those words, and at the same time, it projected a future full of possibilities. At the fair, Carmen spoke with visitors, made contacts, and even closed a deal to distribute our oil in a gourmet store in the city. I watched her from a bench, feeling that it was no longer necessary to intervene. She handled every situation with confidence, and I simply enjoyed the moment. Some neighbors came over to greet me and congratulate me on what a capable granddaughter I had. I just nodded and smiled because I hadn't just fulfilled my role as a grandfather, but also as a teacher. Returning home that evening, we sat on the porch with 2 cups of tea. The moon was illuminating the fields, and the air was filled with the scent of the lavender we had planted months before. "Grandpa, I think we're getting there," Carmen said, looking toward the horizon. "No, Carmen," I replied. "You're getting there. I only paved the way. You're walking it." She looked at me with a mixture of pride and tenderness that left me speechless. Before going to sleep, I took one last walk through the olive grove. I touched some trunks, inhaled the scent of the damp earth, and listened to the night sounds. I realized that although my time here wouldn't last forever, what we had built would, because the estate no longer depended on my strength or my presence. It now lived in Carmen's hands and heart, and that was the greatest victory I could take with me. Summer arrived with its intense light, and the days were filled with the scent of ripe olives and warm earth. My strength was fading, so I spent more time on the porch, watching Carmen oversee the harvests and organize the laborers. She brought me a glass of fresh water every so often and sat down to tell me how sales were going, new orders, and the improvements she had in mind. I listened attentively, feeling that I no longer needed to intervene because the farm was safely in her hands. That peace of mind was a gift that not all parents or grandparents receive in their lifetime. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, I asked her to accompany me to the oldest olive tree of all, the one my grandfather had planted with his own hands. I handed her a small knife and asked her to carve her initials into the trunk next to mine and Mercedes's. "Why?" she asked with a smile. "Because that way it will be clear that this farm has continuity, that the roots aren't cut off when one leaves, but rather spread out." Carmen carved her letters carefully, and when she finished, she hugged me in silence. That night, while we were having dinner, I told her there was something else I wanted to leave her. I went to the office and returned with a small wooden box. Inside was a gold chain with an olive branch pendant, which had belonged to Mercedes. She wanted this to pass on to the woman who would take care of this land after me, I explained. Carmen moved her hand to her mouth and promised me she would never take it off while she worked on the farm. It was a symbol, yes, but also a way to remind her every day of the responsibility and love she carried on her shoulders. As the weeks passed, I noticed my body was starting to crave more rest. Carmen insisted that I take care of myself, that I no longer attempt to do heavy labor. I obeyed, not out of weakness, but because I knew I no longer needed to prove anything. I had done my duty, I had defended what was ours, and I had prepared the only person worthy of it to continue. That certainty made me smile, even on the most tiring days. One Sunday at dawn, we went for a walk together along the path that runs through the olive grove. The air was fresh, and the sky had that pinkish hue that heralds a clear day. We stopped at the top of the hill, overlooking the entire estate. Carmen took my hand and said, "Grandpa, everything I'm here is because of you." I shook my head and replied, "No, Carmen. It's because of what you have inside. I just showed you where to look." That same day, I felt the time had come to close a chapter. I returned to the office, took out a blank sheet of paper, and wrote a few lines. This farm is not just land. It is memory. It is effort. It is love. May whoever inherits it understand that caring for it is caring for those who built it. I signed my name, folded the paper, and kept it in the attic chest. It wasn't a legal document, but a letter from soul to soul for future generations. With the arrival of autumn, the estate was more alive than ever. The lavenders were blooming, the olive trees were full of life, and the air was filled with that familiar smell of firewood and bread. Carmen had managed to make every corner breathe history and future at the same time. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about Isabel, wondering if she would ever understand why I did what I did. But even if I didn't understand, I knew I had acted out of love and justice, and that was enough. Today, as I write these last lines from my armchair on the porch, I see Carmen walking among the olive trees, overseeing the harvest with the same determination I once had. And I understand that my life has come full circle. The farm remains in the hands of those who love it, the roots remain firm, and the legacy is secure. If I didn't wake up tomorrow, I would leave with the peace of knowing I kept my promise. Because it's not just about leaving an inheritance, but about leaving the certainty that even when one is no longer here, what truly matters lives on. Sometimes I think there's no more valuable inheritance than leaving someone the certainty that they're capable. Land, houses, money, all of that can be lost. But what you learn, what you feel, and what you care for with love, that's what stays. And if this story serves any purpose, it's to remind us that protecting what we love isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. I'd love to know if you've ever had to stand up for something or someone that meant the world to you. How did you experience it? What did you learn? Tell me, because maybe your experience can also light a spark in the heart of someone else going through the same thing right now. If you know someone who needs to hear that it's possible to set boundaries without ceasing to love, share this story with them. Sometimes, a single word comes at just the right moment and changes the course of a life. And if you want to continue following stories like this one, where real life teaches us lessons we never forget, stay tuned. There's always a place here to share and listen with an open heart.